Hi everyone, welcome to Pastor's Desk, Ep.3, and today we are going to be taking a look at the issue of illustrations and take you through some of my decision making over the last couple of weeks in preaching sermons on Good Friday and Easter Sunday, and then I'll also maybe touch briefly on last week's first sermon on the series on the Trinity. And so let's get to it. How do we use illustrations? When should we use them? What's a process for determining what kind of illustration to use? On Easter morning, I dealt with John 10 verses 17 to 18, and the sermon title was "No One Takes It From Me." And let me read it to you just so you get a sense of the passage. It comes from the section in the discourse of Jesus being the good shepherd, in contrast to the Pharisees, the thieves, the hired hands who only steal, kill, and destroy. So here's the passage. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father. So the idea behind choosing this passage for Easter Sunday was that we had worked through some passages that I felt kind of led well up to this. We had done one last sermon. I think we did a total of about 4 sermons kind of dealing with COVID-related issues. The last of which was conspiracy theory, taking a look at Isaiah and, do not call conspiracy everything that these people call conspiracy. And there, of course, the focus was to some degree on evil and sin in the world and how we respond to that. And then kind of building on that to some degree on Good Friday, we took a look at the idea of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. I believe the passage was from Luke, if I'm not mistaken, where Jesus says, "This is your hour and the power of darkness." And we took a look at the evil of the power of darkness and of sin. And so, I wanted to contrast that with then the power, the victory, the strength of Jesus Christ on Sunday morning, and the fact that even in the midst of his arrest and being beaten, and even as he's being, led by soldiers, and in the midst of this, he's in control. He is absolutely in control. And to then ask the question, will you put your life and your death in the hands of Christ? And if not, who are you going to trust with your death and your life? Because for every person, you will have to die, and after that to face judgment, as it is appointed for each one of us. So my idea here is kind of Jesus as the superhero. Now, again, to some degree, I'm choosing this passage because it fits well in where I've been going. And so, it's not just that this passage was given to me. I'm choosing this, but now I've got this passage. I've developed an outline from it. I'm not going to go into that. We've talked a little bit about outlines already. I actually did, though, switch outlines in the middle of my week. I had chosen out an outline that made sense kind of systematically to me, but I realized that it was something that was maybe a little bit more inferred from the text. Not that I think that's always a problem, but I went with an outline that I felt better represented the text itself, which was the commission, that the Father sent Jesus to die. Jesus' control. We went to John 18 and took a look at some aspects of Jesus' control there in the Garden of Gethsemane in John 18, and then conquest. And we kind of finished by saying, listen, you want your death and your life in the hands of the one who can belittle the cross, who can mock evil powers, and who can taunt death. So commission, control, conquest was the outline that I ended up going with. And so then I had this idea, and the question was, what do I do to illustrate this? how do we get into this passage? And so I'm kind of working with the idea of Jesus as the superhero. What do I use to illustrate that? So often when I am trying to work with illustrations, there's a few different ways that illustrations work. Sometimes as I am kind of writing my sermon or jotting down ideas, sometimes illustrations will come to me just as I'm writing. Although those tend to be sort of smaller illustrations, things that I might use kind of in the middle of the sermon. I will often, though, not always, but often use an illustration to start the sermon, every once in a while to end. And if it's particularly brilliant, I might try to, start with it and then come back to it at the end if it really works well that way. In all honesty, I probably don't finish sermons as well as I begin them. But with a really good presentation, you'll try to do that, right? You'll try to come back around and finish in a way that connects with the beginning. And if you can do that with an illustration, all the better. First, I want to, maybe before I get into my decision-making process about the illustration and how I went about trying to develop an illustration and what I finally settled on, maybe I'll talk a little bit about illustrations in general. If those people that are expositional preachers, maybe more reformed in their perspective, and really want to making sure that we get deeply into the text. We make sure that the text is, is speaking to us, not just us pulling out what we want. There may be a tendency to downplay illustrations, and I would definitely say that illustrations are not the most important thing in a sermon. I would say that the text leading to application is the most important part of that, and maybe at some point in the future I'll talk a little bit about how both of those things need to be there. Not just seeing what the text is saying, but it has to get to application. That's really, really important. But the idea of illustration, there are some preachers out there, and in fact, if you read sermons by others, some early church fathers, some maybe Puritans or Reformers, depending on who you're most familiar with, you might find that there are some preachers and teachers that really don't use illustrations, at least not in any kind of significant way or in introductory way. I think good preachers are always using illustrations, at least in smaller ways, right? You're putting forth a principle, and then it might just be in one sentence that you talk about, use some kind of illustration in that. But for instance, one of my favorite preachers is John Piper. He really doesn't use a whole lot of illustrations. He starts just in the text. Just here's our passage, and then he goes. So I don't mind that. Having said that, I do think that illustrations can be very helpful. And I do think it may be useful to grab attention and try to get people kind of into the sermon, to connect with it personally, to engage interest. And I think illustrations can be very helpful in doing that. So if you're a younger preacher or teacher, I would encourage you not to just kind of throw illustrations by the wayside. They serve an important place. It has also been said that for Eastern listeners, that illustrations are particularly important. They tend to think in those terms. Maybe not just Eastern people, but there may be certain kinds of people that just tend to, stories tend to grip them in a particular way. And so we want to make sure that for those kinds of people that our sermon is, and teaching is really hitting them where they're at as well, whether or not, we're that kind of person. So back to the particular process for this Easter sermon. The idea is that Jesus Christ is this superhero. He is, no one can touch him. This is actually one of the reasons I like the Gospel of Mark. The way the Gospel of Mark opens is that Jesus is portrayed as this this super messiah kind of hovering over top of everything. Nothing can touch him. He's just going this way and that, performing all sorts of miracles. Again, it's not the only perspective that we have on Christ, but it's an important one. It's an important one. Not even, at this hour of the power of darkness is he, is he subdued. Really, he's in complete control. So where do I go for that? One of the first things that occurred to me, of course, is the idea of the superhero. And, I start going through some of the superhero movies that I've watched recently, some of them with my children. However, I don't tend to use a lot of movie illustrations. And I tend to be relatively cautious about the movies that I watch. There are certain Marvel movies, for instance, that I won't watch because either I find that maybe they get into things that verge on issues or topics that I don't think is I just think is dangerous, maybe the occult in some ways, or I don't want to make light of or make humor. Make jokes of things that I feel are shouldn't be made jokes of. Shouldn't be matters of humor and especially sexual innuendo and that kind of thing. So I would think that my tolerance levels are maybe lower than some. Although I've met people that would say, Paul, maybe your tolerances are higher than they ought to be. So it's a matter of maybe some freedom, some subjectivity. But one of the things that a preacher has to keep in mind is that when they are using movies or literature as an illustration, that there's a sense in which they're saying, this is okay to watch or engage in. And I think we need to be very, very careful of that from the perspective of the weaker brother. And so for myself, I don't tend to use movies as an illustration, unless they're rated G. Every once in a while, I might use the example of a movie that's maybe PG, but again, I try to be really careful with that. So with that out of the way, I thought, sports is a good way to illustrate this, and my mind immediately went, as a basketball fan, to Michael Jordan. I saw Michael Jordan play, and he was absolutely dominant at times. In you had the sense that he was just controlling the game, even when he may not have been scoring much. He was, he felt like he was absolutely in control. Now, there have been some transcendent talents in basketball, even quite recently. I think you could make an argument for the, people like James Harden, who else? Stephen Curry. But I think that probably the most recent basketball player that has that level of just complete domination would be LeBron James. There are times where in his in his career where, he doesn't have to score, but he's still in control of the game. Because I have used basketball at times, I decided not to go there, although you'll see in a minute that I actually came back to it at one point. I started thinking through and actually did some research on, who are the most dominant sports athletes in history? And so I found a few. It's fascinating, actually. I may have spent a little bit more time on it than I ought to have. But I found some interesting lists of most dominating athletes in the history of sport or currently in sport. And one name kind of jumped out to me, and that was Roger Federer. Roger Federer is a tennis player, dominant. And I pursued that actually for some time and read a couple articles on him. And yet it was fascinating. I came to realize I haven't kind of been taking in tennis at all recently, and it became apparent that actually there's a couple newer tennis players. Well, Rafael Nadal, he's not recent anymore, but he has now almost caught up to, or in some people's minds, surpassed Federer. There's another tennis player out of East Europe. I think his name's Djokovic. And again, if you're a tennis player, you're probably or a tennis fan, you're probably laughing at me right now. But I thought to myself, well, listen, if I'm going to talk about the absolute domination or transcendence of Christ, I better not choose somebody that, maybe not even the best, most dominant player right now in his sport. So I went then to Wilt Chamberlain. And the reason I almost went with Wilt Chamberlain in my example, in my main illustration, is that he was somebody who not only was absolutely dominant as far as a scorer, rebounder, there was just no one like him that could match him in his day and age, but also there's this unique story where, and again, how much of this is myth, I don't know, but the story is that at one point in his kind of mid career, that he had won tons and tons of scoring championships and titles, and the knock on him is that he was just a scorer. Now that's ridiculous. He was not just a scorer. He was a rebounder par excellence. He was so much more, but maybe he felt some criticism that he was selfish and was only a scorer. And so the way the story goes is he decided that year he was going to win the title for the most assists, and he did. So again, kind of showing his transcendence, his domination. And to be honest, I can't remember exactly why I decided not to go with that, but I settled on Alexander Karelin, the Russian wrestler. And I think one of the reasons I settled on him, kind of thinking back, was the fact that there is this aspect then of the wrestling of fighting, right? So it really fits well with this idea of Jesus being in this warfare. Kind of just fits better. I think to some degree all sports have this idea of warfare to them, which is probably why guys in particular tend to like sports, but it really comes through in the illustration of Karelin. Alexander Karelin was absolutely dominant. I mean, in his international career, he only lost once. In his entire career, he only lost twice. One, and again, these were bookends of his career. One was early on from one of the reigning Russian champions. Another was his very last fight or match in Greco-Roman wrestling. I believe it was at an Olympics. I mean, he was phenomenal. He was transcendent, and so I went with him as an illustration. And I just, when I get into an illustration, I really want to make sure that I'm understanding that illustration well and to put a little bit of time into it. So I read 2-3 articles on Alexander Karelin. There was one article, I'm not sure if I'm not prepared to bring it up right now, but there's one article that was just phenomenal. I think it was in an older version of Sports Illustrated. No, there's two articles that are really well done. And so I was able to use that then to really illustrate that Jesus is transcendent, and how, even people fighting him felt like, fearful that my opponent really is the one who's in control. I felt that went quite well. So all in all, I won't always spend this amount of time on an illustration. Because it was Easter Sunday, and perhaps also because I feel like there may be others that may eventually, maybe online or eventually may watch this sermon who aren't believers. I wanted to really spend a bit of extra time on developing this illustration well. All told, I probably spent actually 4 hours on trying to get this illustration from beginning to end. That starting with how do I illustrate this, through to reading all the articles and forming and writing something. That's a little bit unusual for me. Normally I won't spend more than half an hour or an hour on an illustration, but that was the case for this special Easter sermon. Last week I started with our sermon series on the Trinity, and again, I felt like an illustration is really important there, in particular because the Trinity can be very abstract. Particularly, my first 3 sermons in this series are going to be abstract. This one was an introduction, and then the other 2 kind of first sermons, one I'll be preaching shortly here on Sunday morning, will be on the triune God in his eternal relations, kind of God as he is eternally. And then we're going to talk about, in the third one, the eternal covenant, which again is back in the shrouded in the mists of time before we get into creation. And we're going to spend some time then talking about God creating and how his Trinity is evident, his triune nature evident in that. So these early ones, somewhat abstract, wanted to make sure that I had a decent illustration. And in my mind, because you're going to see this reflected in this series, because I believe personally that the Trinity has been, at least in Reformed circles, kind of a little bit overanalyzed, a little bit over-systematized, treated in kind of a cold fashion, in my mind. I wanted to find an illustration that illustrated the approach that I wanted to take. And so I thought about this idea of exploring the Trinity, exploring the doctrine of the Trinity, in the sense of kind of exploring a new and foreign land that's mysterious and inviting. And so, I went back to my first geography class, more than 20 years ago, in college, I guess 25 years ago now. And the idea that when people first saw, British Columbia, which, was among the last, major places on Earth that were, discovered, that people wrote back and kind of like, dragons are here kind of thing, right? Like here be dragons, where, BC is, this place where you've got these mountains that reach up into heaven and these cliffs that are miles high and these forests that are absolutely impenetrable. I could have gone with that, but the thing that eventually I settled on was that one of my children was doing some work on Marco Polo, and I had done some. I've done some reading in Herodotus, and again, you have this idea, this flavor of the travelogue. I've read very little of Marco Polo, just a little bit in preparation here, but kind of gave me the same sense as reading Herodotus, that kind of bringing in the person. Let me share with you the wonders of the world that I've experienced, and so I used that as an illustration to help people understand the idea of, here's this mysterious land that maybe you haven't seen before or traveled, but we want to invite you into it, and how the adventures of Marco Polo were kind of first seen by Europe, the Europeans that read his tales, and how they seemed to him to be, to many people, just to be fabulous, and yet have been largely corroborated since being written. So I do think illustrations are important. I do think that they help those who are listening to us, or those who we're teaching, to kind of have some hooks, to put the teaching and the ideas, the principles that we're giving them onto, so that they can remember them, so that they can feel them and apply them to their lives more easily. So I encourage you to spend a bit of time when you're doing teaching and preaching, to spend some time thinking through your illustrations. Again, I like to use them kind of to help people engage initially. You may find that you can use them maybe more sporadically throughout the sermon, or maybe to come up with some kind of illustration at the end. Some people will, as they read or think of new ideas, some people have systems for writing down illustrations. To be honest, maybe it's just me. It's never really worked for me. I use Evernote, I use Logos. Those are two major tools for me. And I do have tags for illustrations. And you know what? I never come back to them. But it may be that that's something that you can, that's something you want to develop. But at any rate, I do encourage you to spend a bit of time developing and using illustrations. I do think it's helpful. And hopefully showing you a little bit of my process over the last couple of weeks. Maybe it's helped give you some ideas about about how to do that. God bless you. Thanks for hanging out with me for a little while here on Pastor's Desk. God bless you. Bye.